Hey, tonight we're digging into one of the oldest obsessions in human history, the fight to outsmart death. From ancient potions and secret rituals to bizarre experiments and cursed inventions, people have gone to terrifying lengths to live forever or bring the dead back. Some tried to trap their souls in statues. Others believed a perfectly preserved body could trick the afterlife. And a few? Well, they may have gotten closer than anyone should. If you're into this kind of late-night journey through the strange and unsettling, drop a like or hit subscribe. It really helps keep this going. And hey, I always love knowing where you're listening from. Drop your city and local time in the comments. Let's build this little global campfire together. So go ahead and dim the lights, maybe tuck yourself in a little tighter, because tonight we're walking through the eerie, fascinating history of every time humanity tried to cheat death, and what happened instead. In the dim, candle-lit corners of medieval Europe, where science and sorcery often danced too close for comfort, there lived a certain breed of optimist, the alchemist. Not your standard snake oil salesman or well-meaning herbalist, but a robe-wearing, Latin-chanting philosopher with big dreams and questionable chemistry. Their ultimate goal wasn't just gold or glory, it was immortality, eternal life, neatly bottled, an escape hatch from death itself, conveniently scrawled in cryptic symbols and hidden behind false doors in dusty manuscripts. They called it the elixir of life, the universal solvent, the philosopher's stone. But really, it was hope, strained through a beaker and often laced with poison. Alchemists were the spiritual ancestors of both chemists and conmen. They spoke in riddles, cloaked their notes in indecipherable symbols, and promised they were just this, close to cracking the code that would let humans live forever. All they needed was a few more rare ingredients, a wealthy patron, and ideally, no questions about the smell coming from their cellar. The oldest whispers of alchemy go all the way back to ancient Egypt and China, where early practitioners already believed that life and death were states of matter malleable, perhaps, if you had the right ingredients. In China, Taoist alchemists mixed cinnabar, aka mercury sulfide, into drinks designed to promote long life. Ironically, those drinks often worked in the exact opposite direction. The emperors who drank them didn't end up enlightened, they ended up embalmed. In medieval Europe, things got weirder. Alchemists chased a mythical object called the Philosopher's Stone. No, not the Harry Potter version that lives in a vault under Hogwarts. This stone supposedly had the power to transmute base metals into gold and grant eternal youth. A two-for-one deal from the universe. Money and time, the two things humans always want more of. The problem was, no one could prove the stone existed. But that didn't stop them from trying, or from burning through a lot of lead, sulfur, and human credibility in the process. One of the most famous alchemists was Nicolas Flamel, a real 14th century scribe from Paris who didn't actually dabble in immortality until long after his death at least, according to legend. Rumors spread that he discovered the Philosopher's Stone, faked his own death, and was now living a quiet, immortal life somewhere in India, or possibly under Paris, depending on who you asked. His supposed tomb was suspiciously empty, which of course only made the rumors louder. In reality, Flamel probably just died like anyone else in medieval France, overworked, underfed, and not immortal. Alchemists were excellent marketers. Their notebooks were dense with mystical diagrams and coded language, partly to protect their discoveries, and partly to mask the fact that most of them were guessing. They'd boil mercury, melt lead, and mix in crushed gemstones, all while whispering prayers and watching for signs from the stars. Some swore that success depended on planetary alignment. Others believed you had to live a morally pure life to be worthy of the stone's power. Either way, their labs were less about science and more about ritual, superstition, and occasionally explosions. Mercury was a favorite ingredient. It was shiny, mysterious, and moved like something alive. Surely alchemists thought this metal had to be the key to transformation. Unfortunately, mercury is also horrifically toxic. It attacks the nervous system, causes hallucinations, and eventually kills you. Many alchemists literally poison themselves in pursuit of eternal life. The irony is thicker than lead, which they also tried to eat sometimes. Take the case of Qin Shi Huang, China's first emperor. Not exactly an alchemist himself, but certainly a customer. Obsessed with cheating death, he ordered his court physicians to find him a potion of immortality. They obliged by giving him daily doses of mercury. He died at age 49, possibly glowing, and was buried in a massive mausoleum surrounded by the terracotta army. His tomb is still unopened, partly because of legend, and partly because modern scientists are worried about the dangerous levels of mercury found in soil samples nearby. That's not metaphor, that's a literal river of poison running through his afterlife starter pack. Despite their many failures, alchemists were often treated with a weird mix of suspicion and reverence. They were simultaneously respected and mocked, admired for their knowledge and feared for their secrets. And while their immortality quests usually ended in disaster, they accidentally advanced real science. The line between alchemy and early chemistry is surprisingly blurry. Distillation, metallurgy, and even rudimentary pharmacology were all born in alchemical labs. You might not get eternal life, but you might get antiseptic. Small wins. As the Enlightenment rolled in with its microscopes and rational thought, alchemy faded into the shadows. It became a punchline, a relic of mystical thinking, but it never fully disappeared. Even today, echoes of alchemy still ripple through the world. Just look at Silicon Valley's obsession with longevity pills and blood transfusions, from the young to the rich. Replace the Philosopher's Stone with a cryo chamber or a supplement stack, and you're halfway back to medieval Europe, minus the robes. So history did try to cheat death again and again, through tinctures, metals, scrolls, and prayers. What it usually got instead was a slow, toxic decline and maybe a really dramatic tomb. But still, we keep trying. Because the appeal of living forever isn't just about fear of death, it's about defiance. About saying, not today, to the inevitable, even if it means downing a mercury smoothie in the process. And maybe that's the real alchemy, turning hope into ritual, ritual into science, and science into myth. Until we try again, with better tools, and hopefully less mercury. There are tough people, and then there's Grigory Rasputin, bearded, wide-eyed Siberian mystic who refused to clock out of life no matter how many times people tried to help him along. He was a peasant, a healer, a holy man, a scandal, and possibly a walking curse in human form. The Russian nobility whispered that he controlled the Tsarina. The common people saw him as a creepy backwoods sorcerer with a gift for not dying, and history remembers him as the man who turned dying into a full-contact sport. Rasputin's life was already improbable before it got mythic. Born around 1869, in a village so remote even its goats probably felt isolated, he grew up illiterate, mischievous, and reportedly able to see things, visions, premonitions, a knack for knowing too much about other people's secrets. He left home on a pilgrimage in his 20s and came back transformed, less drunk, more Jesus-y, but also weirder. He began to cultivate his spiritual persona, mixing Eastern Orthodox theology with a dollop of folk mysticism and an uncomfortable amount of charm. Eventually, he stumbled his way into the heart of Russian power, the court of Tsar Nicholas II and Tsarina Alexandra. There, he performed what some saw as miracles. The imperial couple's only son, Alexei, suffered from hemophilia disease that turned small bruises into life-threatening bleeds. Rasputin was said to calm the boy with a touch or a prayer, or maybe just by telling the royal doctors to stop poking him with leeches. Either way, it worked. Alexandra was convinced Rasputin was sent by God. And just like that, this stinking, unwashed peasant from Siberia became the unofficial spiritual advisor to the royal family. The aristocracy hated him, not because he smelled, he did, or because he acted above his station, also true, but because he was clearly influencing state matters. Rasputin wasn't just whispering bedtime prayers, she was allegedly helping pick ministers, firing generals, and throwing lavish, debauched parties. He gained a reputation as a womanizer, a drunk, and a heretic, depending on who you asked. The whispers turned to plots. The nobility wanted him gone, like yesterday. So they tried to kill him. And this is where Rasputin stopped being a controversial monk and started being an urban legend. The most famous attempt came in December 1916, when a group of nobles, including Prince Felix Yusupov and Grand Duke Dmitry Pavlovich, lured Rasputin to a palace under the pretense of wine, cakes, and pleasant conversation. The cakes and wine, crucially, were laced with cyanide enough to kill several humans or at least one particularly unlucky horse. Rasputin ate. Rasputin drank. Rasputin did not die. So they shot him. In the chest. At close range. He collapsed. Everyone exhaled. Then Rasputin got back up. He lunged at his attackers, allegedly muttering something about needing to report this to the Tsarina, and staggered out into the courtyard. They shot him again, and again. Eventually, they beat him, tied him up, and threw him into the frozen Neva River. When his body was pulled from the ice, his arms were reportedly raised, as if he'd been trying to break through the surface. Cause of death? Probably drowning, because of course it was. Now, not every detail of this story has held up under modern scrutiny. Autopsy reports were fuzzy. Some of the more dramatic flourishes were added later, and historians argue about whether cyanide was even used. But the central truth stands. They tried very hard to kill Rasputin, and he made them work overtime for it. What makes Rasputin so fascinating isn't just his improbable survival, it's how perfectly he embodied the anxiety of a collapsing empire. Russia was already falling apart. World War I was dragging on. Revolution was brewing. And here was this unkillable mystic lounging around the palace, dripping scandal and prophecy in equal measure. To his supporters, Rasputin was a divine figure, misunderstood and martyred. To his enemies, he was a symptom of everything wrong with the Romanov regime: decay, corruption, superstition, and arrogance, all wrapped in one greasy beard. After his death, things didn't exactly improve. Just a few months later, the Romanovs were overthrown. Rasputin had predicted that if he died at the hands of the nobility, the royal family wouldn't survive a year. He was right. Nicholas, Alexandra, and their children were executed in 1918. And yet Rasputin never really left. His name still lingers like incense in Russian history. In ancient Egypt, death wasn't an indigent, it was a bureaucratic inconvenience, a transition, a lengthy, spiritually complicated customs checkpoint between this life and whatever came next. And if you were a pharaoh, you didn't just die, you prepared. You made sure your soul had the correct paperwork, your body had the deluxe embalming package, and your tomb had enough gold, furniture, food, curses, boats, cosmetics, and possibly live servants to convince the gods you were worth letting into the eternal VIP lounge. The Egyptian afterlife wasn't some vague paradise in the clouds. It was a structured, documented journey with specific challenges, tests, passwords, and cosmic gatekeepers. The gods had high standards. You didn't just show up in the afterlife, you had to prove you were clean, literal, and spiritual. That's where mummification came in. Your body had to be preserved because the soul, or Ka, would return to it. If it rotted, you were spiritually homeless. And no one wanted to spend eternity couch surfing between failed tombs. So the embalming process began. First, remove the brain through the nose, with a hook, because subtlety was for amateurs. Then the internal organs were taken out and placed in canopic jars, each guarded by a specific deity. The stomach, intestines, lungs, and liver all got their own fancy containers. The heart, you might think, would be treasured, but no, sometimes it was left in. Sometimes it was yanked out. Sometimes it was replaced with a stone heart. Depends on how dramatic your priests were feeling that day. After that, the body was dried out with natron salts for weeks, then oiled, wrapped in linen, and layered with amulets and spells. Each fold was a magical seatbelt for the ride into eternity. The Book of the Dead part spellbook, part travel guide, was tucked into the wrappings or painted on the tomb walls. It contained instructions for the soul, including what to say when being judged, which gods to flatter, and how to avoid dying a second time. Yes, you could die. Again, in the afterlife it was, like spiritual permadeath. Then came the tomb. The bigger the better. If you were a true king, your pyramid was your resume. The shape, they believed, pointed toward the sun, helping launch the soul skyward. But pyramids weren't just fancy graves, they were full-blown survival bunkers. Food, drink, clothes, wigs, makeup, weapons, games, even furniture. If it existed in life, it was packed for death, and not symbolically full loaves of bread, vats of beer, entire beds made of gold-plated wood, just in case you needed a quick snack or a nap en route to the field of reeds. And the wealth, oh the wealth. Gold wasn't just for showing off, it was considered the skin of the gods. So everything was gold. Masks, sandals, sarcophagus linings. Tutankhamun, the boy king with a famously cursed tomb, was buried with over 50 items. Jewelry, chariots, walking sticks, and even a board game called Senate, which he may or may not have been good at. There were also daggers, one of which was made of meteorite iron, which somehow feels like a cosmic flex. Of course, where there's gold, there's looters. Egyptian tomb raiding was practically an industry, both ancient and modern. Many tombs were robbed within decades, some even by the very workers who helped build them. But the pharaohs tried to deter this with curses. Carved warnings like "death shall come on swift wings" weren't just poetic. They were legal threats from beyond the grave. Whether they worked is up for debate. Archaeologists in the 20th century certainly started sweating when a few too many of them dropped dead under weird circumstances. Coincidence? Maybe. Creepy? Definitely. The real magic of it all, though, is how seriously they took it. This wasn't superstition. It was science, philosophy, theology, and architecture, all braided into one majestic anxiety spiral about what happens after we close our eyes for the last time. The ancient Egyptians were obsessed with continuity making, sure that the soul never felt lost or forgotten. That's why they carved names into everything, why they made statues, why they told stories. Immortality didn't mean living forever in your body, it meant being remembered, which is, when you think about it, exactly what they achieved. We still talk about them, still marvel at their pyramids, decode their glyphs, squint at their faded murals. Their attempt to cheat death wasn't subtle, was an arms race against decay and time. And while their bodies may be crumbling in museums and tombs, their names, their rituals, their fears and hopes they live on. Ironically, that might be the closest any of us ever get to immortality, being a bedtime story thousands of years later, told in the flickering glow of a screen. And somewhere, deep under desert sands, a long-dead scribe smiles. Because the afterlife wasn't supposed to be quiet. It was supposed to echo. The thing about cheating death is that it rarely comes with a receipt, but that hasn't stopped some people from asking the ultimate question: what if we just paused? Not cured, not resurrected, just frozen. Put life on hold, like a particularly dramatic Netflix binge. That's the basic pitch behind cryonics. Freeze your body, or at least your head, after death, and wait patiently in a glorified meat locker until science catches up and brings you back. No big deal. Cryonics got its first real buzz in the 1960s, which makes sense. That era gave us moon landings, LSD, and the firm belief that anything was possible if you had enough tinfoil and optimism. The idea wasn't entirely new. Jules Verne and H.G. Wells had already played with the concept in fiction, but the real-world version took its first awkward breath when a psychology professor named James Bedford died in 1967 and became humanity's first frozen hope chest. His body was packed in dry ice, stored in a capsule, and rolled into the annals of scientific curiosity, with the vague promise of, "See you later." Spoiler: Bedford is still chilling. The science, such as it was, hinged on the fact that low temperatures can slow biological processes to a near halt, freeze the cells, preserve the tissue, stop decay. In theory, if you could somehow prevent ice crystals from forming and shredding everything inside you like microscopic shrapnel, your body would remain salvageable, not living, not rotting, just paused, like a particularly grim leftovers container. But here's the tricky part. Freezing is easy. Coming back? Not so much. No one has yet thawed a cryonically frozen human and lived to tell the tale here, told any tale at all, really. Some frogs and worms can survive being frozen. People, however, are a bit more high maintenance. That hasn't stopped people from trying. Cryonics facilities, mostly in the US and Russia now, offer posthumous preservation for those willing to bet on the future. Whole body preservation can cost upwards of $200 for those on a tighter budget or who don't mind being a talking head. Eventually, neuropreservation, ka, just the brainless, available at a discount. It's basically the Costco version of eternal life. And yes, there are actual warehouses of frozen bodies and heads, stacked like very expensive, very quiet hotel guests. Alcor Life Extension Foundation and the Cryonics Institute are two of the most well-known operations. They maintain massive tanks of liquid nitrogen called dew-wars, where the patients always called patients, never corpses, because branding matters float in frozen limbo, waiting for the day medicine figures out how to reverse death, cure old age, and maybe reattach a head or two. There's something undeniably unsettling about it. The idea that your final resting place might be a giant metal thermos in Arizona or Michigan, that your loved ones could be visiting your tank instead of your tombstone, that your grand reawakening might be in a century where people don't speak your language, eat your food, or know why anyone ever used Twitter. And yet people sign up. Tech CEOs, futurists, science fiction fans, anyone with enough money and enough fear of death to roll the dice on cryonics. They're not delusional, necessarily just hopeful. Or maybe terrified. Maybe both. The ethical questions, of course, are endless. If someone comes back 300 years from now, what kind of life are they waking up to? What rights would they have? Who pays the electric bill until then? And more existentially, if your body is intact, but your soul has long since moved on, or dissolved, or looped back, or whatever it does, what exactly are they bringing back? There's also the rumor mill. Despite popular belief, Walt Disney is not cryonically frozen. He was cremated. But the myth refuses to die, possibly because it's just too deliciously ironic, Mr. Frozen himself suspended in time. Still, hundreds of real people are, frozen and more, sign up every year. In some ways, cryonics is just the modern version of the ancient tomb. Instead of pyramids and gold, it's stainless steel and nitrogen. Instead of prayers and amulets, it's insurance policies and legal documents. But the dream is the same. Don't let this be it. Don't let the lights go out and stay out. Hold on. Just a little longer. Maybe someday, science will deliver on the promise. Maybe one of those frozen heads will blink open, breathe deep and say, "I knew it." Or maybe they'll just sit there, quietly evaporating into history's strangest freezer section. Either way, cryonics remains the ultimate expression of human denial. A desperate, expensive, oddly hopeful attempt to ghost death itself, to outwait the reaper in a frost-bitten bunker of optimism. And if it works, well, congratulations, you're back. But now you owe 300 years of back taxes, and everyone you loved is dust. Still it beats nothing. Maybe. Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor of a unified China, was not exactly chill about mortality. When he wasn't busy crushing rebellions, burning books, or commissioning enormous walls visible from space, he was obsessing deeply, wildly about never dying. He didn't just want to rule China, he wanted to rule forever. And in a particularly ironic twist, it was that very obsession that killed him. Because when you take mercury pills for immortality, you usually get a fast track to the opposite. Let's back up. Qin Shi Huang came to power in 221 BCE, after a bloody unification of warring states that made him both feared and fantastically powerful. He declared himself Shi Huangdi, or First Emperor, a title nobody had dared claim before. And once the power went to his head, so did the paranoia. He believed that death wasn't just a personal inconvenience, it was a cosmic insult to someone as important as him. So, like many powerful men with too much time and too few boundaries, he turned to mystics, alchemists, and snake oil salesmen who promised eternal life in small, toxic doses. These advisors, always eager to avoid execution, recommended a cocktail of potions and elixirs meant to extend his life. Their main ingredient? Mercury, which, even in ancient times, was known to be a little spicy, not quite safe, definitely not food. Still, Emperor Qin drank them religiously, daily, like morning smoothies for the deeply delusional. He also sent expeditions out into the ocean looking for mythical islands where immortals supposedly lived. Whole fleets were dispatched to find the fabled Penglai, a paradise where death didn't apply. Spoiler, they didn't find it. Some of the ships never came back at all. Whether they got lost, sank, or just decided to ghost the empire is unclear. By the time Qin Shi Huang was in his late 40s, he was physically deteriorating. The mercury, unsurprisingly, was doing its job. His health spiraled, his mind became erratic, and his death came somewhere along a royal road trip in 210 BCE. But even in death, he remained dramatically committed to not being dead. Because while he couldn't stop the dying part, he could build an afterlife big enough to pretend he hadn't. That's where his mausoleum comes, in an underground palace city complex, larger than some modern towns, containing everything a ghost emperor could ever want. Real rivers were replaced with mercury ones, and according to historical records, they flowed beneath stars painted on the ceilings and constellations mapped in gemstones. This was not just a tomb. It was a simulation of eternity, engineered by thousands of workers who were probably killed to protect its secrets once construction finished. Ancient Chinese texts describe automated crossbows rigged to fire at intruders, shifting corridors, and buried treasures protected by layers of traps. It was a death trap designed for life of paradox in stone, bronze, and mercury vapor. The pièce de résistance of this necropolitan wonderland? The terracotta army. Discovered in 1974 by farmers digging a well, this literal army of clay soldiers over 80 strong was meant to protect the emperor in the next world. Each statue is unique. Detailed armor, hairstyles, facial expressions, archers, generals, even acrobats. A full court of afterlife functionaries, standing in eternal formation. Yet the emperor's actual tomb, the central chamber, where his body supposedly lies, remains unopened. Not out of respect, necessarily, but because modern archaeologists are genuinely afraid. Mercury levels around the mound are dangerously high. The structure is delicate, and the idea of triggering a 20-year-old booby trap is, understandably, unpopular. So, to this day, Qin Shi Huang remains sealed inside his fantasy of forever, surrounded by toxic rivers, cursed darts, and an army of clay yes-men. His legacy is equally complex. On one hand, he built the foundations of imperial China. On the other, he was a brutal, paranoid ruler who murdered scholars and poisoned himself into Immortality's punchline. Still, there's something deeply human about his fear. Qin Shi Huang wasn't the first to panic about death, and he wasn't the last. But few went to such elaborate, expensive, and wildly toxic lengths to deny it. He tried to bottle eternity, to micromanage the afterlife, to outbuild the Reaper. Instead, he gave us a warning disguised as a wonder that even the most powerful emperor, with all the armies and alchemy in the world, can't drink his way out of the inevitable. Especially not if the drink is 100% mercury. If you think today's obsession with celebrity merch is intense, wait until you hear about medieval Europe's hottest collectibles, saintly body parts. A bit of bone, a lock of hair, maybe a pinky finger, all lovingly preserved, venerated, and occasionally stolen. These weren't just macabre souvenirs. They were believed to be vessels of divine power. And in a time when death lurked behind every fever, famine, and farm tool, people clung to anything that might give them an edge, even if that edge came from the knuckle of a long-dead martyr. The logic, if you can call it that, went like this. Saints were holy, and holiness didn't just vanish after death. It lingered, like spiritual radiation. Their bodies, or pieces of them, were charged with sacred power, the kind that could heal wounds, ward off plague, or just make your crops slightly less miserable. So naturally, churches and monasteries competed to acquire the best relics. The more famous the saint, the more valuable the piece. And if your local abbey had the skull of St. Cuthbert or the femur of St. Agnes, pilgrims would come from miles around, donating coins and faith in equal measure. This turned the whole process into a divine popularity contest. Relics weren't just symbols of faith, they were economic engines. A good relic could put your monastery on the map. A great one could pay for cathedrals. And the line between sacred commerce and spiritual eBay got very, very blurry. Soon, the market exploded. pilgrimages were big business, and everyone wanted a piece, literally. If your town couldn't afford the whole skeleton of a saint, no problem. You could buy a single tooth, or a vial of holy blood, or a piece of cloth that may or may not have touched a martyred ankle. Anything could be turned into a relic if you had the right paperwork, a willing bishop, or a very creative backstory. That's where things got weirder. As demand outpaced supply, the relic trade slipped into something less than holy. Forgery ran rampant. Medieval Europe ended up with enough pieces of the true cross to build Noah's Ark twice. Multiple churches claimed to have St. John the Baptist's head, sometimes more than one. There were duplicate fingers, triplicate arms, and so many nails from the crucifixion that Jesus must have looked like a carpentry experiment gone wrong. But nobody was especially eager to fact-check. Relics were about faith, not forensics. And in a world where medicine was guesswork and demons were blamed for dental pain, the idea that a bone fragment could heal you wasn't just comforting, it was logical. Of course, not all relics were equal. First-class relics were actual body parts. Second-class relics were items the saint had touched. Third-class relics were things that had touched something else that had touched the saint. It was a holy pyramid scheme of physical contact, a long-distance game of spiritual telephone. Relic hunters became a thing, too. These were individuals or church agents who scoured the countryside or battlefield looking for bodies to dig up. Occasionally, they resorted to straight-up grave robbing. More than one monastery mysteriously acquired a new saint after a discreet midnight excavation. There were even accounts of rival churches stealing each other's relics, prompting theological debates that went something like, "Yes, but our dismembered toe has cured more lepers." The church tried to crack down from time to time. Councils were held, edicts were issued, relics had to be authenticated, usually by someone in power who may or may not have ever seen the original saint alive. But the demand never slowed. In an age before X-rays, DNA testing, or even reliable maps, nobody could prove much. And honestly, few people wanted to. The relic trade worked. It brought hope, money, crowds, even miracles, or at least stories of miracles, followed in their wake. Today, many of these relics still exist, housed in ornate reliquaries that are often more impressive than the bones themselves. They're displayed in gilded cases, carried in processions, and occasionally kissed by pilgrims who, thankfully, don't ask too many hygiene questions. Some are likely genuine, some are definitely not, but all of them point to the same very human impulse, the fear of death, and the hope that we can touch something that has outlived it. In the end, the cult of saints and their holy bones wasn't really about cheating death. It was about sharing in a cheat that had already been pulled off. If a saint could die and still work miracles from the grave, maybe death wasn't such a full stop after all. Maybe, if you stood close enough to their dusty ribcage, some of that immortality would rub off. Or maybe you were just breathing in the sacred fumes of medieval optimism, one relic at a time. Transhumanism starts with a simple, terrifying premise. What if the body is the problem? Not war, not disease, not even death itself, but the inconvenient, meat-based shell we're all currently stuck in. What if, instead of dying, we could upgrade, back up the brain, download the soul, slide consciousness into a sleek new chassis, like changing your phone case? This is the dream of the transhumanist movement and immortality, shaped not by religion or magic or divine intervention, but by tech. And if it sounds like science fiction, that's because it still mostly is. But don't worry, that hasn't stopped anyone from trying. Transhumanists believe death is optional, at least eventually. If the body can be patched, replaced, or ignored entirely, then we don't have to check out when it stops working. Instead of a tombstone, why not a terabyte? Instead of a funeral, a firmware update? It's a seductive idea, especially for the kind of person who already thinks sleeping is a waste of time and that emotions are a software bug. At the heart of it is the concept of mind uploading. The goal is to scan the brain, its memories, personality quirks. That specific anxiety you get when someone walks slightly behind you, and convert all of it into data. Store it in a server, simulate consciousness, and voila, eternal life. Now in beta, you might not have skin or a heartbeat, but your digital ghost can still argue about movies on the internet. The catch, of course, is that nobody knows how to do this. The human brain is the most complex object in the known universe, and mapping it with full fidelity is still way out of reach. We're not even sure what consciousness is, let alone how to transfer it. But that hasn't stopped people from building startups around it. One of the loudest names in this space is a company called Neuralink, founded by a guy who thinks tweeting is a leadership style. Neuralink's idea is to implant chips in your brain that can eventually sync with devices. Right now, they're testing it on pigs and paralyzed monkeys. Eventually, they want it to record thoughts directly, giving you a shortcut to upload selfies from your prefrontal cortex. Other companies, like Nectom, have proposed preserving the brain by chemically embalming it for future scanning. The downside? It's 100% fatal. But hey, if you were going to die anyway, why not go out preserved like a biological USB drive? Then there are the digital afterlife projects companies that ask you to record videos, memories, and personality quizzes so they can one day build an AI you. The results, so far, have been less immortal soul and more awkward chatbot that reminds your spouse of how you misquoted movies. Still, believers press on. Some transhumanists freeze their bodies or brains in cryonic facilities, hoping that future scientists will resurrect them with better tech and fewer ethical restrictions. Others plan to live long enough for life extension therapies, genetic engineering, nanobots, organ printing to kick in and keep them going indefinitely. These are people with Excel sheets for their mortality. Longevity is the project, and time is both the enemy and the sandbox. Of course, there are a few problems. First, identity. If you copy your mind into a computer, is that still you? Or just a very convincing imposter who remembers your Wi-Fi passwords? Philosophers have been fighting about this for decades, and nobody's blinking. Because if uploading your brain kills your body and maybe your soul, then it's less like immortality and more like existential outsourcing. Second, hardware. Let's say it works. You're in the cloud now. But what happens when the server goes offline? When the company that owns your brain gets acquired, or your consciousness is stuck buffering forever because of a power outage? Immortality becomes a subscription service. And if your credit card expires, well, so do you. Third, ethics. Who gets to live forever? The rich, obviously. Immortality tech doesn't come cheap, and early access will almost certainly be gated by wealth. It's hard to imagine a future where we've solved death without first solving inequality, and harder still to trust a bunch of tech bros with eternal life when they can't even build a stable social media platform. Still, the fantasy persists, not because it's practical or even plausible, but because the fear of death is bigger than reason. Transhumanism isn't just about cheating death, it's about refusing to accept that the end is the end. It's about believing that with enough data, enough drive, and enough RAM, we can reverse the final punctuation mark of human life. So here we are, staring at the glowing screen, surrounded by wires, imagining a future where your grandkids won't visit a grave but download a conversation with you. Maybe it'll glitch. Maybe it'll be wrong. Maybe it'll forget the name of your dog. But maybe, just maybe, you'll still be there. Waiting in the cloud, still processing, forever buffering. If you were born in the 1400s and didn't love your odds of aging gracefully through plagues, pirate raids, and questionable hygiene standards, you might have been tempted by the legend of the Fountain of Youth, a magical spring that supposedly reset the ravages of time, offered flawless skin and eternal vigor, and absolutely did not exist. Still, that didn't stop generations of explorers, grifters, and monarch-funded adventurers from trying to find it. Because if history teaches us anything, it's that humans will gladly die trying to avoid death. Enter Juan Ponce de Leon, a Spanish conquistador with a name built for dramatic foreshadowing and a resume that includes pillaging, sailing, and questionable cartography. He's the man most often linked to the Fountain of Youth, even though the whole association may have been retrofitted by chroniclers looking for a good story. But let's not ruin the myth just yet. According to popular lore, sometime around 1513, Ponce sailed off from Puerto Rico with the dream of discovering eternal youth and instead discovered Florida, which is like the opposite. Now, was he really looking for a literal magical spring? Historians argue about that. The more boring theory is that he was actually searching for new lands to colonize and name after saints. But boring doesn't get you bedtime stories, and it certainly doesn't sell the image of an aging conquistador, sword in hand, hacking through swamps in pursuit of immortality. The idea of a fountain that grants youth wasn't new either. Ancient Greek historians wrote about springs that reversed aging. Herodotus mentioned one in Ethiopia. Alexander the Great allegedly stumbled across something similar on one of his campaigns, and medieval maps were littered with fantasy. You had lands of gold, cities of silver, and somewhere always just over the horizon, a miraculous water source that made age irrelevant. These tales were part myth, part metaphor, and part colonial fuel, because what better justification for claiming a piece of foreign land than it might have magical water in it? The indigenous peoples of the Caribbean and Florida were said to speak of healing springs, often through translators with questionable motives and even worse accuracy. It's entirely possible that what someone described as a cool stream that helps with sunburn was translated into eternal youth lives here. So Ponce landed in what's now St. Augustine, Florida, planted a Spanish flag, and set about exploring what turned out to be one very humid disappointment. No shimmering springs, no glowing pools, just bugs, heat, and terrain that wanted him dead. He kept pushing forward, until a Calusa warrior reminded him rather firmly that Florida was already occupied. Ponce was shot with a poison-tipped arrow and died shortly after, which is poetic in a tragic sort of way. He went looking for eternal youth and found a very mortal finish line. But the myth didn't die with him. The Fountain of Youth lived on in travelogues, paintings, and tour guides with a flair for storytelling. In fact, there's still a tourist attraction in St. Augustine claiming to be the Fountain of Youth. For just a few bucks, you can sip from a sulfurous well and pretend it's turning back the clock. Spoiler, it's not. Unless your idea of rejuvenation includes mild nausea and a sulfur aftertaste. Still, the metaphor stuck. People wanted to believe there was a cure for aging that didn't involve kale, yoga, or awkwardly aggressive skincare routines. Over the centuries, versions of the fountain popped up all over the world. Himalayan springs, Amazon rivers, and mountain caves all claim the same properties. Drink here, they promised, and walk away unwrinkled. None delivered. In modern times, the hunt for eternal youth just swapped its armor for lab coats, anti-aging clinics, stem cell treatments, and cryogenic chambers all try to accomplish what Ponce de Leon couldn't. Scientists work to slow telomere decay, extend cell life, and map the genome's expiration date. We haven't found the fountain, but we've located some interesting plumbing. The truth is, the fountain of youth was never really about water. It was about hope, that age isn't a sentence, that time isn't the only storyteller. For explorers, it meant avoiding the fate of dying on a boat before 35. For kings and queens, it meant holding on to power. And for the rest of us, it meant not waking up one morning and realizing our knees now sound like bubble wrap. Ponce de Leon may not have found the fountain. He may not have even looked for it. But the myth he's tangled in still bubbles through time, whispering that somewhere, just out of reach, is a place where time takes a break, where your skin resets, your spine aligns, your joints forget the stairs. It's a beautiful dream, even if it's built on bad maps, wishful thinking, and the stubborn refusal to grow old quietly. And maybe that's what makes it so enduring, because even if the fountain isn't real, the longing for it always has been. Krakatoa didn't just explode once. It built up. The first explosion was bad. The second, worse. The third, destroyed most of the island. And the fourth, on August 27th, was the one that unzipped the air itself. That final blast is estimated to have been 10,000 times more powerful than the atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima. The pressure wave from the explosion traveled around the world 7 times. Barometers recorded it in Boston, in Paris, in Cape Town. That's how loud Krakatoa was. It rang the earth like a bell. So yes, science can now say that the red sunsets and blue moons were the result of light scattering and sulfur aerosols. But at the time, all people knew was that their sky had turned alien. That familiar cycle of day into night had been rewritten in bruised neon. Even now, Krakatoa's legacy lingers. It became a symbol not just of natural fury, but of how beauty and devastation can collide in the atmosphere. The sky didn't fall, but it did wear grief. It wore it loud. It wore it hot pink. And just maybe, it laughed a little while doing it. You wake up one morning in the year 536 AD. Stretch. Look out the window of your thatch-roofed home, if you're lucky enough to have one, and immediately notice something's off. The sun is up, but it's wrong. It glows like a weak coin, pale and small, like someone smeared it with ash. The sky has that weird gray-yellow color that makes your stomach twist, like the calm before a bad decision. And the birds? They're quiet. Too quiet. This wasn't a bad week, or even a bad season. This was the start of what historians now call the worst year to be alive. It wasn't just gloomy weather, it was a worldwide atmospheric event that kicked off a decade of chaos. Crops failed, empires staggered, famines broke the back of entire regions. The sky dimmed for 18 months, and no one at the time knew why. Ancient chroniclers wrote about it with the kind of panic that only comes from watching nature misbehave for too long. The Byzantine historian Procopius, who usually wrote about wars and emperors, just casually dropped into one of his histories that the sun gave forth its light without brightness, like the moon. He wasn't trying to be poetic. He meant it literally. For more than a year, daylight felt like twilight, and twilight felt like bedtime for the planet. Cassiodorus, a Roman official in Italy, described it even more bleakly. We marvel to see no shadows of our bodies at noon. Imagine walking outside in the middle of the day and not casting a shadow. You'd probably assume something apocalyptic was happening. You'd be right. The weird part is that this wasn't just a regional problem. Chinese records noted similar dimness, failed harvests, and bizarre atmospheric conditions. Irish annals report a failure of bread across the land. In the Andes and Central America, ice cores suggest sudden drops in temperature. Something huge had happened, but for over 1,000 years, nobody knew what. It wasn't until the 1990s that scientists, like history detectives with better tools, began to piece it together. They analyzed ice cores from Greenland and Antarctica and found a layer of volcanic sulfate deposited right around, you guessed it, 536 AD. The culprit? Likely a massive volcanic eruption, or maybe even two, somewhere in the northern hemisphere. Possibly Iceland, possibly North America. The exact volcano is still debated, but the outcome was clear. Ash and sulfur blasted into the stratosphere, forming a veil around the Earth that reflected sunlight back into space. Nature's version of turning the dimmer switch all the way down. The result? Global cooling, like a lot of it. Some areas saw temperature drops of up to 2.5 degrees Celsius, about 4.5 degrees Celsius. Crops didn't ripen. Fruit trees didn't blossom. In China, snow reportedly fell in August. People wore winter clothes in summer. And as you might imagine, when food stops growing, civilization gets moody. The famines came next, like vultures waiting for the weather to finish its slow-motion punch. In Europe, the food shortages triggered waves of migration, internal strife, and economic collapse. In the Eastern Roman Empire, already stressed by wars and political drama, the dimming sky felt like divine punishment. The Sasanian Empire in Persia wasn't faring much better. And just when the world was starting to maybe adjust to its new, colder, gloomier reality, nature doubled down. In 541 AD, a few years after the mysterious cloud faded, the first recorded outbreak of bubonic plague erupted in Constantinople. Yes, that plague. The one that would go on to haunt Europe for centuries. It was like the earth had decided it didn't want roommates anymore. Taken together, the decade that began in 536 was like the tutorial level for how bad can history get. The climate shock, the famine, the plague, the chaos. It was a rolling disaster that would help trigger the collapse or weakening of several empires, destabilize entire regions, and rewrite the political map of Europe and Asia for centuries. And what's eerie is how it just started. One day the sun shone normally. The next, it was acting like it had a hangover. People didn't understand aerosols or volcanic particulates. They assumed it was punishment, divine wrath, a cosmic omen. And honestly, who could blame them? Even now, with all our science and satellites, we're still vulnerable to the same kind of event. Another massive eruption, think Yellowstone, or even just a large Icelandic volcano like Lakikuld, inject enough ash into the sky to darken it again, to bring back those gray, hushed days where the sun flickers like a dying light bulb and crops second-guess their career choices. So when historians call 536 AD the worst year to be alive, they're not being dramatic. It wasn't one single catastrophe, it was a cascade. A domino effect of cold, hunger, and despair, all kicked off by the sky deciding to go grayscale. You don't need a meteor or a war to feel like the world's ending. Sometimes all it takes is for the sun to stop shining like it used to. And when that happens, it's not just crops and economies that suffer. It's faith, hope, the simple trust that tomorrow will be better, brighter, warmer. In 536, the answer to that was, not today. maybe not for years. The morning of February 15, 2013, started like any other in the Russian city of Chelyabinsk. It was cold, because it's always cold in February in that part of the world. People were getting ready for work, heating up their tea, packing lunches, navigating icy sidewalks, and generally not expecting the sky to throw a tantrum. But at 9:20 a.m., the universe decided to make an entrance. First, a light appeared in the sky bright enough to cast shadows, more dazzling than the sun, and moving fast. It wasn't just a streak. It was a flashbang, a cosmic headlight punching through the atmosphere at over 40 miles per hour. People looked up, squinted, grabbed their phones, dash cams, because Russia is the unofficial dashcam capital of EarthCod, every second of it. A flaming ball tearing across the sky, white-hot and blinding. For a moment, it felt like the world had paused to stare. Then came the boom. Actually, not one boom, multiple. A delayed series of sonic cracks that shattered windows in 7 cities, knocked people off their feet, and triggered every car alarm in Chelyabinsk. The shock wave, traveling much slower than the light, finally caught up to the confusion and punched the city in the face. Over 500 people were injured, mostly from flying glass. Schools were evacuated, buildings were damaged, and still no one knew what had just happened. Was it a plane crash? A missile? Something worse? For a few dizzying hours, the internet did its thing. Theories flew, panic brewed, but pretty quickly, the science stepped in and confirmed what the sky had just dropped. A meteor. A chunk of rock about 66 feet wide, weighing roughly 13 tons, had entered Earth's atmosphere and detonated over a major city. Not a direct impact, thankfully, but an airburst, the same type of explosion that flattened Siberian forest in the 1908 Tunguska event. Just smaller, closer, and recorded from 10,000 angles. The meteor exploded about 18 miles above the ground, with the force of approximately 400 and 7,500 kilotons of TNT. That's 30 times more powerful than the Hiroshima bomb. It blew out doors, cracked walls, and left a smoking trail in the sky that looked like a god had dragged a paintbrush across the atmosphere. And here's the part that really gets under the skin. We didn't see it coming. No telescopes caught it in advance. No warning system buzzed. The meteor came from the direction of the sun, where our telescopes are basically blind. It arrived quietly, invisibly, until it was suddenly very loud and very real. Earth, that day, had a near miss not in the miss the planet sense, but in the thankfully exploded before it could punch a hole in the city sense. Fragments of the meteor did survive the explosion and rained down in small chunks across the region. The largest piece, over 400 pounds, was eventually pulled from the bottom of a frozen lake. It now sits in a museum, a quiet gray rock that once knocked an entire city sideways. Scientists, of course, were thrilled, not about the injuries or the property damage, but because this was the most well-documented meteor event in modern history. Thousands of videos, tons of eyewitness accounts, a real-time case study in what happens when space decides to get personal. But for the rest of us, it was a sobering reminder. We like to think of space as far away, distant, calm, something you look at through a telescope or admire in a planetarium. But the truth is, we live in a cosmic shooting gallery. Earth is constantly bombarded by bits of rock and ice. Most burn up in the atmosphere without incident. Some survive. A few like this detonate with enough force to break stuff. And the scariest part? Chelyabinsk wasn't even a big one. If that rock had been just a little larger, or hit at a slightly different angle, the damage could have been catastrophic. The city was lucky. The explosion happened high enough in the atmosphere to spare it the worst. But it also exposed just how unprepared we are for a space rock with a different attitude. The Chelyabinsk event triggered a flurry of global discussion about planetary defense. Suddenly, things like asteroid tracking and deflection weren't just sci-fi plotlines, they were policy goals. NASA, ESA, and other space agencies started pushing harder for funding to detect potentially hazardous near-Earth objects. Think Bruce Willis in Armageddon, but with more spreadsheets. Meanwhile, Chelyabinsk quietly rebuilt. People replaced their windows. Teachers explained meteors to wide-eyed kids who now had dashcam footage of their own sky apocalypse. And some probably kept one nervous eye on the horizon, just in case the sky had more opinions to share. Because that's the truth of it. The sky doesn't care what day it is. It doesn't care if you have a dentist appointment or a birthday party. It doesn't ask permission before dropping flaming reminders that we live on a fragile rock floating through a debris field of ancient cosmic leftovers. The 2013 Chelyabinsk meteor wasn't the end of the world, but it could have been. Or at least, it was close enough to make us feel the edge of what that would look like. A silent rock, a flash in the sky, a boom that rattles bone sand, a very loud message from above. You are small, the universe is large, and sometimes breakfast is interrupted by fire. Imagine standing in a snowy field in 1859. You've just finished a long day of hauling hay, tending to livestock, or sharpening bayonets depending on your station in life, and you're looking forward to the kind of quiet only the 19th century could offer. Then, just as you're about to douse the lantern, the night sky explodes, not with fire or thunder, but with light. Curtains of shimmering green and red ripple above your head, undulating across the stars like God's ghost waving goodbye. You drop your lantern, you mutter a prayer, because you've never seen anything like this, and neither has anyone else around you. You don't have Instagram filters, scientific explanations, or satellite weather apps. You just have raw, unfiltered fear and the superstitions passed down from every nervous grandparent before you. And this looks like an omen. The northern lights are aurora borealis. If you're feeling fancier, one of the most beautiful natural phenomena the sky has to offer. Today, we admire them from Icelandic spas, Canadian tundras, and TikTok reels set to chill synth music. But centuries ago, these same glowing waves in the sky weren't just beautiful, they were terrifying. Because they were unexpected and unexplained, and in many cases, incredibly well-timed with disaster. Take the Carrington event of 1859, the biggest solar storm in recorded history. On September 1, British astronomer Richard Carrington was in his observatory when he spotted something weird, a burst of light from the sun like a solar sneeze. He didn't know it yet, but that was a solar flare, a huge, angry explosion hurling charged particles toward Earth at high speed. And when those particles hit our magnetic field, they set off a geomagnetic tantrum that lit up the night sky with auroras brighter than any on record. The northern lights were suddenly visible as far south as the Caribbean. People in Cuba saw the sky glowing red and thought the world was ending. In the northeastern United States, miners woke up in the middle of the night and started making breakfast. Because the sky was so bright, they thought it was morning. Telegraph systems sparked, caught fire, and sent messages even when unplugged. The electromagnetic chaos made 19th century tech look possessed. In Europe, the lights were visible from Rome to Paris to Madrid. Red, green, purplet looked like the heavens were bleeding. Religious leaders took to pulpits to warn of Judgment Day. Farmers worried about blight. Soldiers panicked, thinking the lights were battle signals or divine warnings. Basically, It was a vibe, but not a peaceful one. And that wasn't the only time auroras ruined someone's sleep. During the American Civil War, in December of 1864, the Northern Lights lit up the night after the Battle of Fredericksburg. Soldiers on both sides reported eerie glows overhead blood-red skies that pulsed with silent menace. Some Union soldiers took it as a sign that God disapproved of the war. Others assumed the Confederacy had conjured something terrible. The heavens felt like they were screaming. And in the silence that followed the gunfire, the lights made everything feel like a stage set for something worse. But the fear of auroras isn't limited to just war zones and solar storms. Across history, cultures all over the world have assigned meaning, often grim to these strange sky flickers. The Inuit believed the aurora was the spirits of the dead playing ball with a walrus skull. In medieval Europe, red auroras were seen as omens of plague or war. In China, they were often interpreted as dragons battling in the sky. And in many indigenous North American cultures, the lights were treated with reverence and fear, something sacred, but not to be trifled with. Even in more recent memory, auroras have made people nervous. During the Cold War, with nuclear fears dialed up to 11, sky watchers on both sides of the Iron Curtain kept a close eye on anything strange. In January 1938, a particularly strong aurora display was seen across Europe. It was so bright and blood-red that fire departments were called out en masse to put out what people assumed were massive blazes in the distance. Days later, Hitler invaded Austria. Many believed the lights were a supernatural warning, or perhaps just bad timing. So why do these lights look so terrifying sometimes? It comes down to color, scale, and silence. The aurora is made when charged particles from the sun hit Earth's magnetic field, collide with gas molecules in our atmosphere, and release energy as light. The color depends on the type of gas and altitude. Green from oxygen about 60 miles up, red from oxygen at higher altitudes, and purple or blue from nitrogen. That means a good aurora display can fill the entire sky with glowing sheets of shifting color like fire, but cold and silent. When you don't expect that, when you have no way to explain it, it's less, ooh, pretty, and more, what did I do wrong? The truth is, we still don't fully understand the long-term effects of geomagnetic storms, especially in our tech-soaked world. A Carrington-level event today could fry satellites, cripple power grids, and basically make your smartphone a shiny paperweight. But even if that never happens again, the Northern Lights will keep dancing. Quiet, cosmic, unpredictable. So next time you see glowing curtains in the sky, remember this: not everyone found them so comforting. To some, they were a prophecy. To others, a celestial warning. And to a few unlucky 19th century telegraph operators, they were a literal shock to the system. You're standing in your kitchen, pouring coffee, when it begins a low, metallic groan that seems to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. It rattles the window pane and echoes in your chest. You look out at the empty street, at the calm sky, and yet it continues. A noise like a rusty ship grinding through the clouds. No thunder, no aircraft, just sound, loud and low and wrong. You ask your neighbor, they heard it too. You check the news, nothing official. You check the internet. So it's happening everywhere. They call them sky trumpets, or the hum, or apocalyptic horns, and they've been recorded around the world: Canada, Ukraine, Chile, Germany, the U.S., Philippines. One day in Florida, another in Siberia. It happens in cities, suburbs, forests, even out in the middle of nowhere. These eerie sounds, sometimes mechanical, sometimes orchestral, always deeply unsettling, emerge from the silence and vanish without explanation. Some people describe it as a metallic wail. Others say it sounds like an ancient door groaning open. A few say it feels almost musical, like a trumpet trying to signal something no one knows how to interpret. Most agree it feels unnatural, and that's the part that sticks with you. Because when the sky makes a noise it shouldn't, when it stops being just background and starts performing a haunting solo, you start asking questions. Recordings flood YouTube and Reddit. Some are hoaxes, sure, clever audio tricks layered onto video, but not all. There are hundreds of credible, verified clips, filmed by people with no apparent reason to lie. Groups of neighbors standing in their driveways, staring up, children covering their ears, dogs pacing and whining, even birds going dead silent. The sky, it seems, knows how to get attention. The first wave of global interest kicked off around 2011, when reports of these sounds began spiking across continents. Kyiv, Ukraine, became one of the earliest viral epicenters. Residents were jolted awake by a deep droning sound that reverberated through buildings. Videos captured the event. No clear source, no planes in sight, no earthquakes reported. Just that noise. A sound no one could place, but everyone felt. Some theorized it was geological tectonic plates shifting under stress, the earth groaning from within. Others blamed atmospheric pressure systems or magnetic storms, likening it to the way a wind instrument plays when air is forced through a narrow channel. Military experiments, secret tunnels, alien messaging systems, these all got tossed into the conspiracy basket too, as did biblical interpretations. The trumpet of revelation, the last alarm before the end of everything. You know, subtle stuff. Science has weighed in, of course. There are plausible explanations, kind of. Some meteorologists suggest the sounds might result from skyquakes, rare atmospheric disturbances caused by sudden temperature inversions, distant thunder bouncing weirdly, or sonic booms from aircraft. Some geologists point to brontides, a term used to describe unexplained rumbling sounds believed to be caused by seismic activity too deep to register as a quake. Others think infrasound, the kind of ultra-low frequency noise you can't hear but still feel, could play a role, especially when funneled through unusual terrain. But here's the thing. None of those explanations account for every incident. The locations vary too wildly. The sounds differ too much. And they don't always correspond to geological or atmospheric events. Sometimes it's cloudy. Sometimes it's clear. Sometimes the sound is isolated to a neighborhood. Sometimes it's citywide. Sometimes multiple cities reported on the same day. The pattern isn't a pattern, and that, more than anything, is what creeps people out. Take the Windsor hum in Ontario, Canada. A low-frequency noise that plagued residents for years. It came and went, sometimes lasting days, sometimes only hours. People complained of headaches, insomnia, anxiety. It was eventually traced to industrial activity on nearby Zug Island. But even with that knowledge, the exact mechanism remained fuzzy. The hum would stop for weeks, then return, like it had a personality. Then there's Taos, New Mexico, where a persistent hum has been reported since the 1990s. Some people hear it, others don't. Tests have been run, maps drawn, sound frequencies charted, but still no consensus. It became part of the town's identity, a mystery with a zip code. The hum that followed people home but couldn't be recorded properly. It's unsettling to be haunted by something no one else believes is real. And we haven't even gotten to the sounds that seem to be coming from the sky itself. Those echoing trumpet-like blasts heard in countries as diverse as Sweden and Costa Rica. Some of them last minutes. Some come in short, sharp bursts. In 2015, a woman in British Columbia recorded a sound so intense, so eerie, that even the trees seemed to flinch. It echoed off the hills. Her dogs hid. And then it stopped. No aircraft, no explosion, no power grid issue, just a sound. Then silence. The human brain isn't built for unexplained noise. We want origins, logic, decibel levels. When we hear thunder, we picture clouds colliding. When we hear a car alarm, we think motion sensor. But when we hear the sky moan like a dying robot or scream like a ghost with stage fright, we don't know where to file that. It touches something primal, a fear that's less about danger and more about confusion. The universe doing something weird and not offering a single line of explanation. So maybe it's tectonic, maybe it's air pressure, maybe it's machinery echoing across landscapes in bizarre ways. Or maybe, just maybe, the sky has opinions. Maybe the planet is muttering to itself. Or maybe, if you want to go full Twilight Zone-ites us, a signal, long delayed, bouncing back. A sonic breadcrumb from a future we don't understand yet. Or a warning we slept through the first time. Whatever the case, one thing is certain. When the sky starts talking, people listen. They run outside. They record, they share, they panic, laugh, speculate, and listen again. Because while the sky may not be falling, every once in a while it screams just loud enough to remind us it's still up there, watching, and occasionally making some very unsettling noise.